The crystal ballroom was silent for a breath. 1,000 whispered conversations suddenly paused. Billionaire Ethan Price had just approached the serving station, his face a mask of shock, his hand reaching out to the service door. Maya Johnson, the waitress he hadn't seen in 15 years, was cornered. There was no escape. "Don't come near me," Maya commanded, her voice low but carrying the fierce, desperate clarity of a threat. She didn't beg. She warned him. Ethan froze, only a meter away. "Maya, You need to forget this moment ever happened, sir." She cut him off, her dark eyes flashing a warning that held 15 years of pain. Her words weren't a plea for pity. They were a shield forged of pride. The guests nearest the table glanced over, intrigued by the confrontation between the celebrity CEO and the defiant, anonymous server. Ethan, the master of leverage and control, suddenly found himself powerless, held captive by the simple, absolute denial of the woman he had failed. He stared at her, the guilt visible in the tremor of his hand. Finally, he whispered, the sound raw and broken, "You can't just disappear again, Maya." She gave him a single, cold, dismissive glance that said she already had. Then, she walked through the service door and was gone. Maya Johnson had spent 15 years perfecting the art of being invisible. She had traded the fierce promise of a law degree for a life measured in tips and quick feet. Tonight, she was a quiet shadow moving through 1,000 flickering lights at the city's most extravagant charity gala, serving drinks to people who would never see her face. This was just another high-paying service gig, anonymous, easy, and essential to keep her quiet life going. The room's centerpiece, both literally and figuratively, was Ethan Price, the $40 billion success story. His custom suit held more value than Maya's entire annual income. He was surrounded by reporters, his smile a practiced, controlled gesture that never quite reached his eyes. He had the world, but he looked like a man haunted by something the cameras couldn't capture. Maya moved toward his table to refill a glass of sparkling water. She had managed to avoid him for 3 hours, moving with a subtle shift of weight and timing only a professional server would understand. But the man seated beside Ethan stood up unexpectedly, blocking her path and forcing her close. As she leaned in, her hand steady, pouring the water, the familiar scent of his expensive cologne hit her. Then their eyes locked. It was a shock of cold recognition that wiped the practiced politeness from her face and stole the air from Ethan's lungs. The billionaire froze, his hand halfway to a reporter's microphone. His mouth opened to speak her name, the name he hadn't spoken out loud in 15 years. Before the sound could escape, Maya delivered a command, her voice low, flat, and absolute, cutting through the 1,000-person din like a wire. "Please, pretend you don't know me." The plea was a silent rejection. It was a clear line drawn in the marble floor of the ballroom, separating his staggering success from her desperate survival. Ethan could not move, unable to reconcile the fierce, brilliant girl who helped him pass geometry with the woman now begging him to remain a stranger. His face betrayed a raw, visible guilt that no amount of wealth could hide. For the next 10 minutes, every smile Ethan gave, every word he spoke to his tablemates, was a lie. He was paralyzed by the image of her moving away, blending back into the shadows of the service door. He finally excused himself, signaling his lead security guard with a sharp look to track the woman named Maya Johnson. The guard returned quickly, his expression confused. "She clocked out, sir. Didn't wait for her final paycheck. Said she wouldn't be back. She had quit. Without notice, without a word, less than an hour after he saw her." The sudden, unexplained disappearance was a ghost repeating itself. Ethan stared at the empty space where she had stood, realizing that the one person he thought he had lost had come back just long enough to confirm she was still gone. The memory hits Ethan like a physical blow, a sudden rush of warm, small-town air replacing the cold precision of the Manhattan Gala. 15 years earlier, The world hadn't yet separated them into CEO and Waitress. They were just Ethan and Maya, two kids with a shared obsession, escaping Lincoln High and the dead-end future it represented. Their study spot was always the same, a chipped stone bench beneath a temperamental streetlight on the edge of town. Maya, then 17, was the undeniable engine of their ambition. While Ethan wrestled with complex calculus, she was already dreaming in case law and political theory. She didn't just teach him to pass. She taught him to think bigger than his small town allowed. Their bond was simple, fierce, and unbreakable. They spoke of the future as a shared adventure, a move to a big city where their intelligence, not their economic background, would determine their worth. "We're a team, Ethan," she'd said once, tapping his textbook. "You get us out of here, I'll keep us honest." But that intense closeness was a magnet for resentment. In the tight circle of Lincoln High's social hierarchy, Maya's brilliance was already seen as an unnatural threat. Cassidy, the principal's well-connected niece, was the most vocal of the jealous group. Cassidy had always eyed Ethan, not for his mind, but for the vague promise of his family's old money, and she hated that Maya possessed the intellectual keys to his future. One Tuesday afternoon, just hours before the biggest chemistry final of the year, Maya was in the library, shelving books for extra credit. Cassidy stood just out of sight, watching. She didn't have the courage to do the dirty work herself, but her bitterness had found a tool, a nervous sophomore named Omar, who owed Cassidy a lifetime of favors. As Maya finally gathered her backpack and walked to the door, Omar made his move. Quick as a snake, he slid a perfectly copied, stapled exam into the side pocket of her textbook bag. The paper was crisp, identical, and utterly forged. Maya never looked down, never felt the slight shift of weight. The weapon that would destroy her future was now resting innocently against her geometry notes. The following morning, the disaster struck with cold, institutional efficiency. Maya, feeling confident after the chemistry final, was called out of class, not by her teacher, but by the principal himself. Whispers immediately followed her down the hall, heavier than any physical chains. In the sterile, unforgiving office, the exam paper was slapped onto the desk. The principal pointed to the untouched, secret copy found in her bag. "We have an eyewitness, Miss Johnson. The evidence is irrefutable." Ethan rushed in, hearing the noise. He shouted. He protested. He swore she couldn't have done it, but his pleas were crushed by the weight of forged paperwork and the principal's dismissal. The irony was brutal. The very network of privilege that was supposed to protect Ethan worked instantly to destroy Maya. She was immediately expelled for academic fraud, her name dragged through the mud. The shame was absolute. Humiliated, Maya walked the long, silent path home. Her dreams of law school were not just postponed, they were officially canceled. At the small apartment she shared with her Aunt Carol, she didn't find comfort, she found finality. Aunt Carol, who had always viewed Maya's ambition as a personal criticism of her own meager life, saw the scandal as a convenient excuse. "You've shamed me, girl. You brought disgrace. Pack what you need and go. I'm done with this town, and you're done with this house." Maya left that night, carrying only a threadbare backpack and the few dog-eared law textbooks she hadn't sold yet. Her heart was a cold, brittle shard. Ethan, finally breaking free from the principal's detention, raced through the evening rain, his old beat-up sedan splashing water onto the sidewalk. He found Aunt Carol standing on the porch, her face hard and unforgiving. When he demanded to know where Maya went, the response was cold and definitive, delivered without remorse. "She left. She's done with this town and anyone in it. She's gone, Ethan. For good." Ethan couldn't accept the finality. He spent the next week in a haze, packing his meager belongings for Oxford. He was leaving on the scholarship Maya's frantic tutoring had secured for him, and the success felt like a heavy stone of guilt pressed into his chest. He decided he wouldn't leave until he tried one last time to fix the disaster. He sat down and wrote a letter, a deep, raw, handwritten confession. He apologized for not fighting harder, for letting the system win, and for not protecting her. He poured out his belief in her future and his promise of eternal friendship. He then purchased a plane ticket for her, a first-class seat to London, to start a new life with him. He wrapped the letter and the ticket in a sealed envelope, drove back to her street, and placed it directly into Aunt Carol's hand. "Please give her this. Tell her I'll wait for her." Carol took the envelope silently. Hours later, after Ethan had gone, Aunt Carol sat alone, holding the thick envelope. She imagined Maya's face lighting up with hope and the two friends flying off to a new life, leaving her behind in the stagnant town. A wave of sick, envious bitterness washed over her. Why should that bright, smart girl get a clean break when I never did? She walked to the backyard incinerator. Without opening the letter, without reading a single word of Ethan's plea, she watched the edges of the envelope curl black. The scholarship, the ticket, the confession, the truth that could have healed 15 years of distance, all turned into smoke and ash. Ethan sat on the plane, looking out over the Atlantic. He believed Maya had simply rejected him, choosing to vanish rather than face the humiliation. The misunderstanding was now sealed, forever separated by fire and betrayal. The first few years were a blur of desperation. Maya took the train north and threw herself into the city's underbelly, trading her brain power for sheer physical endurance. She worked menial jobs, cleaning hotel rooms, washing dishes, catering. The dream of becoming a lawyer was slowly ground down, replaced by a simple, brutal truth: survival. There was no time for reading, no energy for ambition. The systemic roadblocks were immense. Trying to find a decent apartment with no credit, no family, and a cloud of academic fraud hanging over her non-existent records. Yet, she never entirely lost the core of herself. She found a small, consistent light by volunteering at a community shelter downtown. There, she didn't talk about contracts or torts. She taught literacy to the neighborhood kids and offered quiet, empathetic advice to single mothers. The shelter became her own secret, unauthorized law school, a place where she practiced the only kind of justice she could still afford: human kindness. She kept a dog-eared copy of a bar exam study guide tucked away, a defiant relic of the woman she was supposed to be. But defiance doesn't pay the rent or feed the fever. The work was unrelenting. Double shifts were the norm. Her body, 35 now, couldn't handle the strain it once could. Late one evening, wiping down a greasy counter after 18 hours on her feet, the world tilted. A blinding, sharp wave of pain shot through her body. She collapsed, hitting the floor with a sickening thud. The exhaustion had finally won. She refused an ambulance, knowing the cost would bury her. But the crisis was already here. Back in her tiny room, fighting fever and hunger, she stared at the pile of unpaid bills, medical forms, rent notices, utilities. The numbers mocked her struggle. She was still fighting, but she was losing this silent, unforgiving war against poverty. If you're still not subscribing, drop a comment what's holding you back. This is only the beginning of Maya's fight, and the billionaire doesn't even know the real danger she's in. You've seen the billboards. You've heard the name. For Ethan Price, the years after Oxford became a blur of relentless, almost punishing success. His tech company, built on the back of his nervous college projects, exploded into a multi-billion-dollar entity. Forbes covers, Davos panels, private jets, the classic success montage. Yet beneath the polished exterior, Ethan was a man running from a ghost. Every $1 billion he earned only seemed to increase the weight of his guilt over the one person he couldn't save. He couldn't smile genuinely. Success felt hollow, like winning a championship after your best player was unfairly disqualified. He started building scholarship funds, always anonymous, always focused on helping students from underprivileged backgrounds escape the kind of systemic injustice Maya faced. but he strictly avoided funding anything in his old hometown, a private, pathetic effort to avoid the truth. He never talked about her. He never searched for her. He simply poured his life into work, a self-imposed penance. For Ethan, every new product launch, every deal closed, was just another way to fill the hole Maya left behind. Then came the inevitable. Preparing for the biggest charity event of the year, the same one where Chapter 1 began, his meticulously organized assistant was running through the list of vendors. Ethan was barely listening, signing documents without looking up, and the catering staff is being handled by Prestige Hospitality. We have a new hire on the service roster, name Maya Johnson. Ethan's pen froze inches from the paper. The familiar, common name hit him with the force of an oncoming train. His breathing hitched. He slowly pushed the documents away. Run that name again. He knew, instantly, that the universe had just decided his time for running was over. The universe had forced his reckoning. Think about the last time you saw someone you truly regretted losing. Now imagine that person has seen you, too. Ethan could barely stand the days leading up to the gala. The fear wasn't that she would ask him for money. It was that she would look at him with disappointment. He was the product of her belief, yet she was now serving him. At the dinner, surrounded by sycophants, Ethan's focus was surgical. He tracked every face near the service doors, his nerves stretched taut. Finally, there she was, 35-year-old Maya, 15 years older, quieter but undeniably her. The brilliant light was dimmed, replaced by a careful reserve. As she came closer, filling his glass, the scent of expensive wine and her cheap detergent mixed in the air. Ethan struggled for something, anything to say, an apology, an explanation, a request. He finally managed to whisper her first name softly, a sound buried in the brassy din of the party. Maya. She flinched. The motion was small, practiced, and devastating. She leaned in, her eyes dead serious. The silent command from Chapter 1 delivered with finality. Please pretend you don't know me. That night, Maya finished her required duties, but she couldn't stay a second longer. She couldn't watch the monument to the life she lost. She needed to disappear again. She didn't wait to cash out, needing the money less than she needed the anonymity. Ethan stood alone a moment later, staring at the deserted coat rack. A simple cotton apron was hanging there. He snatched it up, running his hand over the coarse fabric, trying to find a trace of her. Tucked deep into the pocket, he found a small square of folded paper. Ethan retreated to his private car, the plush leather of the back seat a brutal contrast to the small, cheap note in his hands. He smoothed the paper and read the few lines of clean, clear handwriting. Don't feel guilty. Some people weren't meant to shine in the same light. Find your peace, Ethan. I already found mine. The note ripped through his composure. It wasn't accusatory. It was protective. Maya was sacrificing her own right to justice to spare his conscience. She was carrying the shame of her failure, so he could carry the weight of his success without burden. He immediately sent his most trusted driver and security team to the address the catering company had on file. Find her. Now. Don't alert the police. Just bring her to me. The driver returned empty-handed, reporting the address led to a rundown, low-rent complex. Then came the call from the security team leader, his voice urgent and panicked. Mr. Price, we reached the building, but we've got a serious problem. The police are there. It looks like her apartment caught fire last night. Imagine rushing toward a disaster only to find the last person you care about was caught in the middle. Ethan abandoned his schedule, his driver, and his reputation, racing through the city himself. He arrived at the scene of the fire, the smell of burnt wood and soaked carpet thick in the air. The small, blocky apartment building was ruined. Neighbors confirmed the worst. A fire had started late the previous night, likely electrical, taking out 2 units. They identified Maya's unit, but insisted she had escaped. She got out fast, one woman said, shaking her head. But she wouldn't take no help from the firemen or the Red Cross. Just clutched that little backpack and walked off. Maya was rejecting salvation, even in the face of absolute loss. Ethan didn't call the police. He didn't call the building owner. He waited until the area cleared slightly, then found a way into the cold, waterlogged remnants of her unit. The devastation was minimal, but absolute for someone with nothing. Everything she owned was smoke-damaged or destroyed. He moved through the rubble, his expensive shoes scuffing on broken glass, and near what must have been her bed, he found a small, half-burnt picture frame. It was her old high school photo, the one taken just before the scandal. On the back, written in a shaky, fading ink that smelled of ash, was the familiar line, "You were always meant to win." Ethan stood there, the smoke stinging his eyes, holding the physical proof of her unwavering, fierce pride. He wasn't crying because she lost everything. He was crying because she still believed he should win, even after everything she had suffered because of him. Is this kind of sacrifice noble or just tragic? Tell us what you think in the comments below. The shock of the fire and the devastating discovery of the note and the photo snapped something vital inside Ethan. The controlled, guilt-ridden CEO vanished, replaced by the desperate young man who had once raced through the rain. He canceled every meeting. He ignored the furious calls from his investors who were now asking, "Who is this waitress who has ruined the CEO?" The press speculated wildly about a secret lover or a massive corporate scandal. No one guessed the truth. He was chasing his conscience. His search was meticulous and obsessive. He didn't want to give her money. He wanted to give her justice. He didn't want to fix her life. He wanted to know why she chose to suffer in silence. Days stretched into a desperate week. Every lead went cold. She had disappeared seamlessly back into the city's unseen population. Ethan felt the old panic returning, the cold realization that he had lost her again. Finally, his chief investigator called, his voice quiet with careful relief. "We found her, sir. She's not using her name. She's volunteering at the Haven Community Shelter in the Bronx. She goes by her middle name, Amara." The investigator added one detail that shattered Ethan's remaining calm. The moment she heard her birth name called out once by a shelter worker, she immediately packed her bag, her eyes full of fear, preparing to vanish yet again. He now knew exactly where she was, but he also knew if he moved too quickly, he would lose her forever. What secret was she hiding that made her run from her own identity? Comment if you think Ethan should call the police with the recording from Chapter 13 or just approach her silently. He was a billionaire looking for a lost friend, but what he found was a different kind of wealth. Ethan didn't storm the Haven Community Shelter in the Bronx. He knew that would only make Maya vanish again. He watched her from a tinted car across the street, an unseen observer in his own emotional drama. He watched the Maya Johnson who was now known as Amara. She was thinner than he remembered, her hands rough from work, but the fire hadn't gone out of her eyes. It had just been redirected. He watched her patiently teach multiplication to neighborhood kids, her voice clear and strong. He saw her comfort a single mother struggling with utility forms. She was poor, wearing clothes that had been donated, yet she radiated a powerful, quiet peace that his private jet and sprawling estates could never buy. Ethan realized with crushing clarity that she hadn't just survived the loss of her dream. She had used the wreckage to build something real and selfless. He had spent 15 years building an empire out of guilt. She had spent 15 years building a community out of kindness. He finally understood the meaning of her note. She didn't want his saving. His guilt, however, demanded action. He needed to know her next step. Later that afternoon, he overheard her conversation with a colleague near the service entrance. Maya sighed, pushing a heavy box of canned goods. "I can't stay here much longer. I need to move upstate." "Some ghosts," she said, not looking at anyone in particular, never stopped chasing me. That single line, the admission that she was still being hunted by her past, was enough. Ethan knew he had hours, not days, before the woman who refused to be saved disappeared forever. He had to show her the truth, no matter the cost. Ethan canceled a board meeting, the final straw for his investors, and flew down to his hometown. He knew the initial lie about the cheating was just a cover. He needed the original, dark reason. He found an old high school acquaintance, Tyrone, who had been part of the peripheral clique back then, now running a small, sad insurance agency. Tyrone was instantly intimidated by the sudden appearance of the famous CEO. Under pressure, Tyrone confessed, shame etching lines onto his face. The entire setup was orchestrated by the principal's niece, Cassidy, who was jealous of Maya's intellect and her closeness to Ethan. Cassidy had felt entitled to Ethan's attention and used a network of favors and weak, scared students to frame Maya. She had even stolen Ethan's heartfelt recommendation letter from Maya and replaced it with a lie that ensured the expulsion would stick. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a targeted assassination of a brilliant future. Ethan finally had the why. Tyrone, desperate for his silence, remembered one thing more. Cassidy kept a detailed, boastful diary back then. Ethan's security team found the niece's old home address and, through careful timing, retrieved an old box from her parents' basement. Inside, tucked among teenage souvenirs, was the diary. The handwriting was neat, the details sickeningly clear, proof of the stolen letter, the planted exam, and the casual destruction of Maya's life. If you had the proof to destroy the person who ruined your life, would you use it? The evidence in hand, Ethan didn't call the police. He wanted a face-to-face confrontation, an acknowledgement of the moral debt. He tracked Cassidy to a high-end corporate law office. She was exactly where Maya should have been. Ethan confronted her in a public but quiet corner of a busy cafe, his security detail watching from a distance. Cassidy, a polished lawyer, initially laughed off the accusation. That was high school, Ethan. We were kids. But when Ethan showed her the diary entry and pulled out his phone, signaling the hidden recording app, her smile dissolved. She began to panic, her professional composure cracking like thin ice. In her fury and fear, she yelled details about the frame-up, boasting about how easy it was to manipulate the weak administration. She was a threat, Ethan. She was never supposed to be on your level. The confession was absolute, raw, and completely recorded. Ethan had his victory. But at that exact, high-volume moment, the cafe door chimed. Maya, who had reluctantly tracked Ethan to the location, worried that his obsession would get him into trouble, walked in. She saw Ethan, the billionaire, standing over a trembling, pale woman, his voice loud, his hand pointing an accusing finger. She didn't see the confession. She only saw her former friend using his massive power to publicly humiliate someone. Maya's face went white with fury. 15 years of quiet resilience shattered, replaced by burning indignation. She marched over to Ethan and grabbed his arm, pulling him away from the stunned lawyer. "You haven't changed at all, have you?" she hissed, tears already blurring her vision. "You don't fix people. You just humiliate them to clean your own rich conscience." Ethan, shocked by her sudden appearance, tried desperately to show her the phone, the recording. "Maya, wait. You don't understand. This is proof." She confessed. She slapped the phone out of his hand, ignoring the sound it made hitting the marble floor. "I don't need your proof. I need you to leave me alone. I build a life without your guilt, without your pity." She pushed him away, the force of her emotional rejection far greater than her physical strength. She had endured poverty, fire, and betrayal, but being the object of his pity was the final, unforgivable insult. Have you ever felt betrayed by someone close, only to realize the real betrayal was self-inflicted? Blinded by her own desperate tears and the chaos of the public fight, Maya stumbled away from the cafe, table, and into the street. She didn't look left or right. Just as she stepped off the curb, a black sedan, speeding well over the limit, came barreling around the corner. The sound was a sickening, tearing crunch, followed by the metallic scream of brakes. Ethan didn't even register the shouting crowd or the police sirens beginning to converge. All he saw was Maya, lying motionless on the pavement. Hours later, the stark white of the hospital room was silent save for the rhythmic beep of monitors. Maya was alive, but unconscious, suffering from a severe leg injury and internal bruising. Ethan sat beside the bed, still wearing his expensive, rumpled suit, holding her unresponsive hand. The power that moved markets and funded empires was useless here. He was just a man stripped down to his most basic fragile guilt. The world he had chased, the billions, the fame, meant nothing when faced with the fragility of the one person who mattered. He stayed for 8 hours, refusing to leave, the silent vigil his penance. He leaned close to her ear, his voice rough with unshed tears. "I'm sorry for every year you suffered because of me. I should have stayed and fought for you then. I should have trusted you." His apology was slow, painful, and absolute. Then, just as the nurse checked the forebag, Maya's fingers tightened slightly on his. Her eyes fluttered open, finding his tear-streaked face. Her voice was a dry, weak whisper, the words a devastating correction of his narrative. "You didn't ruin my life. I've just stopped believing in mine." Her words were the real truth he was chasing. They were a confession of her own failure to maintain hope. If this happened in your town tomorrow, wouldn't you want to know how she recovers and what she does next? Subscribe now. Imagine finally knowing the truth of the betrayal, only to discover the man you hated was actually trying to save you. In the hospital room, the harsh fluorescent lights felt softer now. Maya's quiet, devastating correction, that she stopped believing in herself, had shifted the burden from Ethan's actions to her own despair. This new honesty opened the door for true healing. Ethan, his voice steady, played the audio confession from Cassidy. Maya listened to the venom and the boasting, the casual way her entire life was discarded for a petty high school rivalry. The betrayal was no longer a phantom. It had a name and a face. Then, Ethan showed her the photograph of the original, charred letter and the first-class plane ticket he had bought 15 years ago. He described leaving it with her Aunt Carol, believing until now that Maya had simply thrown it away. Maya didn't cry. She broke. The realization that her own flesh and blood, consumed by envy, had deliberately burned her escape, her last hope, and the chance for friendship, was a deeper cut than the expulsion itself. The distance between her and Ethan wasn't fate. It was the cruel, deliberate act of one bitter person. Ethan immediately pitched his final offer. "Let me fix the record. I will pay for everything, the school, the apartment, everything. Start your law degree again, Maya. Let me finish what I started." Maya looked at his hopeful, desperate face. She held his hand, the small, thin hand of a man who had not slept properly in days, and refused. "No, Ethan, I don't want your charity. I want my justice, and I want to earn it." The answer was definitive. Ethan, a man used to getting his way, accepted the refusal. He understood. Maya wouldn't take a gift. She needed a platform. Within a month, the Broken Streetlight Foundation was born, named after their old study spot. It wasn't about scholarships for the rich. It was about providing legal and financial support for young women who had been unfairly pushed out of the education system. Maya was hesitant, but she couldn't say no to the mission. She joined as a volunteer director, using her years of survival and shelter work to guide the organization. The work was brutal, but it was theirs. They worked side by side, Ethan supplying the funds and the structure, Maya supplying the grit and the soul. They were finally the team they were supposed to be. The foundation's launch event was a huge success. As Maya spoke to the first group of young women, her voice resonating with genuine experience, a nervous junior staffer handed her a sealed, heavy envelope. It was marked personal and confidential. Inside, Maya found a letter from her dream university. It was a formal law school acceptance letter dated 2 days earlier. Below the official seal was a handwritten note from the dean. Full 4-year tuition covered by an unnamed, private scholarship, contingent on your acceptance. Maya's hands trembled. Ethan caught her eye from across the room. He didn't wink or smile. He just gave her a simple, exhausted nod. Some secrets refuse to stay buried. When they finally surface, they often take down the people who kept them. Aunt Carol, seeing the Foundation's coverage on the local news, finally cracked. The guilt, festering for 15 years, became too much to bear. Uninvited, she showed up at a community fundraiser, eyes red, shaking violently. She waited for a quiet moment, then loudly confessed, pulling focus from stage. She stood before Maya, her voice cracking, admitting to the betrayal, the envy, and the ultimate crime, destroying the letter and the plane ticket. She confessed that she had knowingly trapped Maya in that difficult life. The room froze. Maya walked to her aunt, embracing the small, broken woman. She didn't need anger. She felt profound sorrow. "I forgave you the moment I realized I was still alive, Aunt Carol," Maya whispered. In that same hour, the emotional and logistical stress finally overwhelmed Ethan. As he was speaking to a donor about the Foundation's next steps, he stumbled, his eyes losing focus. He collapsed violently, hitting the ground. The room went into chaos. His assistant rushed to the ambulance, her face pale. She saw Maya standing, frozen, and delivered the shocking truth. He's been ignoring the warnings. A severe, undiagnosed heart condition. This event, it might have been too much. The intensive care unit was silent and cold. Ethan, the billionaire, was reduced to tubes, wires, and a fragile, monitored sleep. The fight to redeem himself had cost him nearly everything. Maya sat by his bedside, holding his hand, now the one giving the silent, steady vigil. She saw the success story stripped bare, just a friend who had lost himself trying to right a devastating wrong. He woke up slowly, looking at her with weak but genuine relief. "Now I can rest," he whispered, his voice thin. "You're finally where you belong, Maya." She held his hand tighter, tears finally coming. She was not crying for the past, but for the man who had traded his health for her redemption. "You belong here too, Ethan," she whispered. "You belong with me." It was the first acknowledgement of love, quiet and true, in 15 years. Then, without warning, the steady, rhythmic beep of the monitor slowed. It stretched out, elongated, turning into a dreadful, singular, high-pitched alarm. Nurses rushed in, shouting numbers and commands. The green line on the screen went perfectly, horizontally flat. The screen fades to a blinding white light. Only subscribers get the full story. Don't be left behind. The screen snaps back to color. Months later, Ethan survived the massive medical event, emerging changed, quieter, but profoundly present. His life was simpler, his focus singular, the Foundation. Today, however, belonged entirely to Maya. She stood at the podium in a tailored black suit, her head held high, addressing the graduating class of a law school she never thought she'd attend. She was a lawyer now, dedicating her thesis to the friend who never stopped believing, even when I did. She had earned her place, every late-night study session, every tough class, a victory over the poverty and the prejudice she had fought. At the ceremony, Ethan sat in the third row, no longer the tense, guilt-ridden CEO, but a man at peace. He looked frail but healthy, leaning slightly on a walking stick, his eyes wet with pride. He saw her, not as the waitress, not as the expulsion victim, but as the woman she was always meant to be. The ceremony ended. Maya walked down the aisle, her degree clutched in her hand. She passed the man who had lost her in the shadows and found her again in the light. She stopped, bent down, and quietly kissed him on the forehead. The girl who once studied under a broken streetlight now stood radiant in her own light, and the man who once lost her finally found true peace. Would you forgive someone who once ruined your life if they helped you rebuild it? Some say Ethan was justified in his obsession. Others call it pure guilt. Tell us in the comments what you would have done in Maya's shoes.